Welcome back to Al Jazeera America. I'm Libby Casey. Coming up in this half hour of international news, the steps one European city is taking to counteract the dangers of air pollution. But first, a look at the stories making headlines across the U.S. in our American Minute. We begin in Colorado, where the head of the EPA visited the site of a major toxic waste spill and toured sites along the Animas and San Juan rivers. Today, Gina McCarthy said the water quality is back to what it was before the spill, but experts warn of heavy metal deposits settling into river sediment. The state of emergency covering Ferguson, Missouri remains in effect tonight. St. Louis County officials have extended the emergency declaration until Thursday. No arrests were reported during late-night protests Tuesday in Ferguson, and the streets appear to be calm. For the first time, Bernie Sanders has pulled ahead of Hillary Clinton in a poll of New Hampshire voters. The independent Vermont senator was favored by 44% of Democratic voters, while Clinton got 37%. The poll was taken by Franklin Pierce University and the Boston Herald. In March, Sanders gained just 8% in the same survey, compared with Clinton's 44%. Presidential candidate and Florida Senator Marco Rubio is blasting the White House tonight for allegedly not inviting Cuban dissidents to Friday's flag-raising ceremony at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. Rubio is just one of several members of Congress pointing fingers at the administration. He called the decision a new low by the Obama White House. Meanwhile, other congressional leaders spoke out in Florida today.
Castro knows that he can fool the Obama administration so easily that we are so hungry for this deal that we're willing to overlook 100 peaceful dissidents arrested just a few hours before the opening of our embassy.
Secretary of State Kerry is going to be raising the American flag. That American flag symbolizes freedom and democracy throughout the world, and so much sacrifice. And unfortunately, he's abandoning all those principles symbolized by that flag. Frankly, what he should be raising is the white flag of surrender, because that is what President Obama and his administration are doing once again.
Some dissidents are expected to meet with Secretary of State John Kerry Friday afternoon at the home of the U.S. Chief of Missions. Kerry will become the first sitting U.S. Secretary of State to visit Cuba since World War II. In our In Context segment tonight, we're going to focus on one of the obstacles to lifting the U.S. embargo against Cuba, the issue of repatriations. U.S. companies have made more than 5,000 claims for billions of dollars lost when the Castro regime seized property in the early years of the revolution. But as Lucia Newman reports from Havana, the Cuban government is making claims of its own.
Most of Cuba still looks like it's frozen in time. A time when most of what you see here was owned by American companies. From the former Sears department store to the grand hotels once run by the American mafia. U.S. firms and American citizens whose property was confiscated after the revolution are demanding up to $7 billion in compensation. But not to be outdone, the Cuban government is claiming damages too, to the tune of $100 billion. That's what it says 54 years of U.S. economic sanctions has cost the country.
Tengo una refinería.
For example, if you have a refinery with U.S. machinery that was paralyzed because we could not buy spare parts, Cuba calculates the losses based on the embargo. There's the prohibition to trade in U.S. dollars, which jacks up prices of everything. All of this adds up.
Cuba is also claiming assets frozen in U.S. banks after the revolution, plus interest. And it blames the U.S. embargo for its dilapidated infrastructure. But while Cuban insiders concede $100 billion is an inflated figure, they say it's a starting point for a negotiated settlement, which for Cuba begins with the lifting of the U.S. economic embargo.
So Cuba can argue very legally, if the sanctions are not lifted, there's no way that we can sit down and negotiate this. And when we negotiate, we are going to give you a bill of what you owe us.
The standoff on who owes what to whom and how much it's worth is not only complicated, it's essential to normalizing bilateral relations. The 1996 Helms-Burton Act, passed by the U.S. Congress, specifically states that all property claims must be satisfactorily resolved before the U.S. economic embargo against Cuba can be lifted.
But Cuba believes it has another card up its sleeve to ultimately negotiate a deal in which both sides agree to call it even.
They'll have to accept. Otherwise, there's not going to be any deal. And of course, the price is investment in Cuba.
With diplomatic ties renewed, many American companies that were expropriated are eager to return to the Caribbean's largest island. But the message seems to be that they'll first have to drop their claims or stay out. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Havana.
Joining me now from Washington is Jason Marzak, Deputy Director of the Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us this evening. Let's start with the American claims. Now, they go back decades and they've been accruing interest all this time. How serious are companies and the U.S. government about ever seeing financial compensation?
Well, Libby, these are pretty gigantic claims. I mean, the claims date back to the early 1960s, and back then about 6,000 properties that were seized amounted to about $1.8 billion. You know, with interest over the last 50 some odd years, this is now estimated about a $7 billion claim. And some of this claim is by companies, but a lot of these claims are, individual claims whose, houses, whose property were confiscated by the government in the early years of the revolution, and subsequently they fled to the United States.
Is there more focus on those personal claims, which carry a lot of weight on a deeply personal level, versus the corporate claims? Is one being focused on more than the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's more weight on the personal claims at this point, partly because the corporations that have claims, Exxon, before it was ExxonMobil, had a claim. There's a variety of other consumer good companies and whatnot that have claims, and a lot of the major corporations right now are focused on how to repeal different aspects of the embargo, and so their lobbying efforts are focusing on Congress and how to provide for greater opening with regard to Cuba.
And as you point out, those companies want to do business in Cuba, so they may have some incentive to overlook the past in a way former citizens of Cuba would not. But Mr. Marzak, let's look at the flip side. So as Cuba tallies the cost of the embargo, what does the government really expect to see? We heard from our report from Havana that there's a $100 billion figure on the table, but it's likely inflated as a negotiating starting point. What do they really want?
Rather than be close to the U.S. number at this point, they're putting out a number that's really going to, they hope, not allow for the United States to really be able to get the full $7 billion in claims that it really desires from the Cubans.
And getting those reparations for U.S. claims is actually required before Congress agrees to lift the embargo on Cuba, so it's held out as something necessary. But it doesn't seem like there's a lot of political will among Republicans, both the House and Senate, to lift the embargo anyway. So is this really a big roadblock?
Really, this is one of the few issues in Washington that really crosses party lines. And what you're starting to see in Washington is a series of bills that they're starting to chip away at the embargo, with the principal bill being one that will lift the travel ban so that all Americans can travel to Cuba without it needing to fall under some specific category, whether it's professional or cultural or research or whatnot, but just allowing blanket travel to Cuba. That bill has nearly 50 co-sponsors at this point in the Senate. So there's also some movement on telecommunications and other aspects of the embargo. So I think that the embargo will continue for at least a few more years to come. Potentially, the transfer of power in Cuba in 2018, when Raul Castro steps down, might be the moment to actually be able to have the political opening to have a real serious lifting of the embargo.
Do you ever expect to see money change hands, or might we see something more symbolic exchange between the two governments?
I think really for Raul Castro's domestic political position, he cannot be seen as handing money over to the Americans. I think that would in Cuba, the issue of the rapprochement with the United States is not overwhelmingly supported by all those in the government. Many in the government do not want any type of opening with the United States because the embargo over the last 50 years has been their scapegoat. It's been their crutch for all the economic problems in Cuba. This has been their excuse for why the regime is not succeeding as the people expect it to. And so there is a lot of movement on the Cuban side to not have the opening happen as quickly as possible. So Raul Castro needs to keep his political position strong within Cuba. One of the things that you could see is you could see some tax incentives being offered, tax-free investments, other types of things. There's some historical precedents for this, not much. There's with regard to Vietnam or with regard to Iran, but we're really entering into interesting new territory.
Jason Marzak, Deputy Director of the Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you.